Right. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome back to a CFCI webinar here. Today, we are going to talk about net zero carbon, and in particular, we're going to talk about the UK's net zero carbon ambitions. And we've got two speakers today, and we'll also be hosting our usual Q&A session at the end. And running the Q&A session today will be Tom Foggin, one of the CFCI trustees. Right, so just a quick introduction to our speakers. It's great news to have today Simon McWhirter from the UK Green Building Council. Simon's a director there, and the reason Simon's here is to talk about their net zero carbon route map, which I've had the pleasure of reading, and it's actually fascinating. It sets some numbers, some targets, some real targets, and goes into some quite interesting detail on how we could get to net zero carbon by I think 2050, or perhaps a little bit earlier than 2050. Let's see what Simon says. Anyway, so Simon's going to set that that framework for us, and then we have Orlando Gibbons from Arup, who is also part of the iStruct. So Orlando, thank you. You've stepped in at the last minute to cover for somebody from LETI who was supposed to be talking today to us about the LETI targets, and in particular the embodied carbon targets. And having said that, Orlando's a very good stand-in, because he's spent quite a bit of time with the iStruct developing some of their embodied carbon guidance, which was recently updated and issued. So really looking forward to both of these presentations today. If I could ask you all in the audience to store any Q&A you have to the end, and we'll put those Q&As to our speakers. As usual, we don't let our audience be seen or heard, unfortunately, but you are allowed to raise your questions in the Q&A or the chat box, and we'll see those, and then we can, that'd be great. Then if we can get a number of questions we can pose to Simon and Orlando, that would be great. Should all be done by 2 o'clock. So as I say, I'm looking forward to this. So first of all, Simon, over to you. If I stop sharing my screen, if you want to share yours, and then we'll go on to the UK Green Building Council's route map to net zero.
Okay, bear with me one sec.
It's okay. I'll let you know when it's sharing. There we go. So we can see your, that's it. Perfect. Over to you.
Thanks very much. As Simon says, I'm here to cover the UKGBC's net zero carbon roadmap for the built environment. For anyone not familiar with us, or indeed with myself, I'm the Director for Communications, Policy and Places. So I look after the external facing bits of the business across our political audiences and wider industry audiences, and also lead on the delivery of our place-based work, which looks at large-scale retrofit opportunities and planning. And we're also expanding across the UK at the moment, having recently opened UKGBC Scotland. And in terms of UKGBC itself, we're a charity and a membership organisation with the rather grandly titled mission to radically transform the sustainability of the built environment. I'm relatively newly joined last autumn, but actually have been a member, a partner or a consultant into UKGBC for the full 15 years of its life. So I feel I know the business pretty well. We're going to focus quite heavily on carbon today, obviously, but it's worth noting that our work spans across much wider issues affecting the built environment, around adaptation, nature, biodiversity, the social impact of what we build and how we live in it, and all those sorts of things. But for today, in terms of the roadmap, I'll just walk quickly through the context of the project itself, the methodology we used, and Arup will come up a few times here, as they were the sort of the lead modelers behind all of this. And then walk through the results and some of the big key priorities, of which we sort of encapsulated into 5 key priorities from that, and then look at the next steps. There's going to be loads of content on these slides, but I put that in not because I'm going to go through it all with you, but what I'll do is I'll PDF it and send quite a large package of information then to you all afterwards. And because there's quite a lot of depth here, I'll probably read from notes a little bit more than I would normally. So apologies if I'm looking askance occasionally. It's because I'm sort of reminding myself on some of the core numbers that I don't want to miss. And when we come to the Q&A at the end, I am not tech guy. I am communications and politics guy. So there may be things that I have to get back to you, and we can do that after today's session. But basically, so on that, the Whole Life Carbon Roadmap project, the whole purpose was to get a common vision across industry as to what needed to be done, how and by whom to get us to net zero carbon by 2050. So we have that legally enshrined law in the UK, and it was about saying in our built environment space, how do we get there across the construction, operation, demolition of all our buildings and infrastructure. And this all flowed from an original low carbon route map from the Green Construction Board back in 2013. And a lot of our methodology and calculation methods follow what was used then to make sure that we're looking for continuity as much as possible. And I'll come back to that because we also made sure we were using the same approaches and pathways as a lot of the Committee for Climate Change numbers, again, to make sure the alignment was there. And we were one of several European green building councils that developed these national roadmaps. We did that all in the run up to COP, and that was funded by the Laudes and IKEA foundations. We actually launched that at COP with the Bays Minister. And it was published initially in a series of 4 outputs. The top one is really the sort of the meat and potatoes, the main report, and that gives an overview of what the built environment needs to do to decarbonize across both operational and embodied carbon, whole life carbon, as it were. The second output is a technical report, and that looks much more at the processes we used around data collection and the key features of the calculation methodology. So that's the report I don't particularly understand. And then the third one is a summary for policymakers. That's the one that I would use the most. That's aimed at central government, local authorities, and anyone with a sort of influencing mind on policies. And I'll come into some detail on this, but basically what that does is give us milestones and trajectories for all the policy shifts that we need to either enable, cajole, or enforce the big shifts in built environment policy that we need over the coming decades. And then the last output that we produced at the back end of last year was a set of stakeholder action plans. So we broke industry stakeholders down into 14 subsectoral groups and set out the actions that each of those needed to do, whether that was a contractor, an occupier, an architect, and what their pathway was to getting themselves tooled up and acting in a way that was aligned with this. So in terms of how we did it, a key aspect of the approach was to ensure there was loads of buy-in. So we ran a process which brought together 30 different stakeholder groups from across the country. Some of the groups highlighted here are individual companies, but in many cases it was industry bodies and sort of pan-sectoral groups. So we were getting the widest input and voice into that as possible. And then we had about 60 people from a much wider range of companies who came together. So the steering group designed the scope and shape and direction of the project. And then these task groups from all these companies were then diving into the nuts and bolts of the sort of the analysing the modelling that was coming out of ARP and another organisations led by Yannick Giesekim, who did the embodied carbon work. And between these different task groups, they developed the carbon trajectories and the industry and policy proposals that were needed to get us there. And then in terms of what we found out, there's loads of detail on what this is, but I will give a very quick description of it. But in terms of scope, we took the scope of our work to be all built aspects of our homes and buildings and wider infrastructure. We did not bring emissions into play from the use of some of those pieces of infrastructure. So for instance, surface transport emissions and stuff weren't included in that. Instead, we focused on all the embodied and operational carbon from the buildings and infrastructure themselves. And that was really to sort of put a bit of ring fencing around things and prevent emission creep outside our work. And the summary is that the UK built environment is currently directly responsible for about 25% of the UK's greenhouse gas emissions. If surface transport is included, that goes up to 42%. And remembering when we talk about emissions here, this is whole life carbon. So this is operational carbon and embodied. So the carbon tied up in the buildings and the built environment, as well as the emissions from using those buildings as well. And what the roadmap did was create a carbon footprint of the built environment. And as I say, this was based on the Committee for Climate Change's data. So in terms of the key elements within this infographic, at the top of that is looking at the total UK greenhouse gas emissions from the built environment, that top circle, and you can sort of see down the right hand side the different sectors that we used. And then dropping down on that sequential cascade towards the bottom, it looks at how much of that overall national emissions picture is directly responsible for the built environment. So that's our 42% halfway down. If we do include surface transport emissions, 25% is directly controlled by the built environment. That's the emissions from the buildings themselves. So then to determine at that point, what we had was the baseline, the carbon footprint impact of the built environment. And what we were obviously trying to do with the roadmap is say, to get to net zero 2050, we need to make massive shifts across all of our primary areas. So we broke things down into existing housing, existing commercial buildings, new buildings, and infrastructure. Those are the sort of the four main groupings. So then to determine the carbon budgets, once we had that carbon footprint and the scope of emissions, what we were able to then do is say, what are the things that need to be done to get us there? So for instance, I've just drawn out a few examples here, but if you look at existing non-domestic buildings, 70% of them have to have heat pumps by 2045. We have to end the sale of gas boilers and oil boilers by 2030. 7.5% of non-domestic buildings have to have hydrogen boilers in the late 2030s. Now, the reason these are all significant for us is A, getting this clarity at a really granular level for each different building type. It means when government put regulation out to consultation at the minute, I can cross compare that to what the roadmap shows, and we can indicate whether we think it's going far enough, fast enough. It gives us an understanding of how quickly skills and supply chains across the market need to get into play to get us to the right places. So there's a lot of these, and I'll send you a lot of this info after the call today. This is showing, this graph is sort of showing the different sectors and how quickly and when it changes to get us to that 2050 stop point. So this graph contains historical emissions up to 2018 and forward-looking projections, which follow two different scenarios, basically. A business as usual scenario. So that sort of dotted line running across the middle is what would happen to built environment emissions if we stuck with the government policy we have at the moment. And roughly speaking, that gets us to a 60% reduction in emissions by 2050, as opposed to the 100% we need. And then a net zero scenario, which is the downward cascade of the colored slices. You can see from the legend on the right-hand side, in terms of what needs to happen in each subsectoral area within the built environment. So that big chunky dark blue bit at the bottom is the existing housing, and as you can see at the minute, that's the lion's share of the impact, and that cascades down. And what I'm going to do next is I'm going to go in now to the 5 key recommendation areas and sort of just highlight a few different bits of detail as to what needs to be done on this. But again, in the report, we've tried to be really, really precise about, indicating exactly what has to happen and when across each area. So this, we've got loads of information in there about what are the key milestones, what are the key policy interventions needed and when. And again, we've been, it's been a tumultuous but very positive 6 months engaging with right across UK government and all the major departments with the roadmap and sort of understanding and talking to them about what that means, from Bays and DLUC before and after Christmas, right through to Treasury last week, along with all the officials and a wide range of energy providers actually in that meeting. So on to the 5 key priorities. These bullet points speak for themselves, but and I'll come on to the detail, but the sort of at a summary level, we have an incoherent approach to how we're going to decarbonize the existing housing stock, which is that big chunky blue area at the bottom of the roadmap graphic. On non-domestic buildings, we're miles off, never mind being miles off a plan, but we're miles off understanding the performance of those buildings. So starting from baby steps around enhancing the amount of energy performance that has to be visible and disclosed and reported. And when it comes to new buildings, one of the key outputs that we need are moving away from an approach at the moment where we design buildings based on a notional energy approach rather than designing for actual energy use. And I'll talk about a little bit of detail on that. At the moment, embodied carbon is ignored in UK regulation, and with the only exception of a few pockets of excellent practice in industry, it's largely ignored across industry as well. And then there has to be a massive investment into national infrastructure, but through a net zero lens, and that's something which is quite absent at the moment. So nationwide retrofitting of our homes, 48% of the UK's built environment emissions come from our houses. That's about 16% of total UK domestic emissions across the country come from our homes. And of that, about 60% is from heating. So shifting us away in our homes from fossil fuel based heating is really key. And some of the key milestones that we then need to see for that are no gas boilers or indeed oil boilers being sold by 2030. We're probably going to need about 10% of homes to be being served by district heating systems by that point. And about 12% of UK homes will be directly heated by hydrogen, although that will be a very geographically distinct approach needed where it is housing developments located near industrial clusters. So you're using sort of hydrogen in an optimal and sensible way. But basically, about 80% of homes are going to need a heat pump. So that's 23 million domestic installations over the next 30 years. So these sort of numbers are slightly terrifying when we think of what that means in terms of installations by year or month or day. And, you know, the sort of the popular press obviously like to frighten us with sort of really horrible numbers about what we're supposed to be doing, but it does show the size of the challenge that we need to come on to. So just to reflect very quickly, that dark blue area highlighted and so, and that's showing the trajectory needed from the national retrofit of homes. And it's pretty robust that ceasing of the sale of gas boilers and that massive uptick in installation of heat pumps. There's a sort of moment in time around 2030 that if we don't get that right, we then can't hit the 2050 targets, whatever is done everywhere else. So there are some really sort of big seismic opportunities and risks in here. So in terms of non-domestic buildings, what we need to be doing is making sure that everything from the valuation to the use of non-domestic buildings are sort of reflecting the energy use in that decision-making process. So making sure that real world performance is visible in the market, that lets it become a sort of factor in asset valuation, market transaction, and ensuring that we're sort of engaging much better with occupiers as well as landlords, you know, in that sort of process. So there's what we need is a performance-based rating system to come in to help drive that. Again, like housing, we need a cut-off date for existing commercial buildings. After 2030, no more gas. We need to keep ramping up the minimum energy efficiency standards as they apply to existing commercial buildings. And we need to get rid of VAT on energy efficiency retrofit works. That's also one of the policy recommendations in existing housing, as is the requirement or the policy shift whereby we start to flex stamp duty so that you get variable stamp duty based on the energy performance of a building, so that at point of transaction, we are encouraging people to A, consider energy performance, and B, address it if that's going to have a financial boon when it comes to calculating that stamp duty levels. All this, I won't go into this in detail, but what this is doing is then saying, well, you know, when we talk about there needing to be a performance-based rating system applying to non-commercial buildings, this is showing the timeline of when that needs to kick in for different sectors. So larger offices, sort of from this year, looking at launching performance rating schemes, disclosure being mandatory shortly after that. And then, you know, a couple of years down the line, we start to look at the ratcheting up of minimum performance standards to try and drive improved behaviour and use of those buildings. Then in terms of new buildings, just a tiny bit more detail on that. You know, everyone will be aware of it, I'm sure, but at the moment we use a notional building approach. So our building regs, our EPCs, they don't really relate to how a particular building is actually performing in terms of the energy it uses. So we need to move to an actual performance approach to energy use and set a really clear and coherent timeline for industry so they can skill up and scale up to get ready for that higher performance standards that are coming. We've obviously got the future home standard and future building standard interim targets this year. And then looking at setting what the standards will be for 2025 onwards. So there's, again, a real moment in time here for us to show the net zero ambition that's going to be necessary and make sure that we're doing that on an actual energy use basis. And on that, so the only other thing is that there's a real life cycle thing here around how we embed that actual energy use into the process. So that can't just be something that happens at the design stage or the construction stage on a technical basis. That has to be right back at the start when we're thinking about contracting, when we're thinking about procurement, and at the back end, we're thinking about management. You know, what is the actual energy performance of that building? And part of that is about technology and design, and part of that is about knowledge transfer and efficient management and an understanding of energy behavior across a much wider group of professionals across the industry. In terms of embodied carbon, it currently makes up 20% of the built environment emissions. And the trajectory shows that obviously as we improve the operational performance of buildings, the relative size of the impact of embodied increases as the operational emissions go down. 2035 is the tipping point when operational have fallen to an extent that embodied carbon emissions become the bigger of the two. But at the minute, embodied carbon is currently completely unregulated. Measurement of embodied carbon, mitigation of the amount of embodied carbon is entirely voluntary within the construction sector. So the roadmap's calling for legislation to be introduced quickly, initially requiring just the measurement of whole life carbon on projects over a certain size. And that's to try and be realistic and recognize where the industry's at in terms of an agreed benchmark, an understanding of different product standards and all those sorts of things. And then after that initial measurement, then we're looking at following that up with the introduction of embodied carbon limits on a ratcheting basis on the way through. And I guess, you know, I'll not dwell on the detail here, but I think, you know, we've spent several decades working through different approaches and policies and industry movements to address operational carbon. And it's time that we take that same sort of level of strategic thinking to the embodied carbon problem. And, you know, there are different spikes that will come. So, you know, embodied carbon, you can see the embodied carbon component. If you look around 2030 there, you'll see it fattens out the proportion of embodied carbon. That's the point at which we will have scaled up supply chain, skilled up enough installers to increase the numbers of housing retrofits in the country. And unfortunately, at that point, we won't have the sufficient range of product materials at a sufficiently low embodied carbon. So we will actually see a bit of a bump in embodied as we get better and faster at doing large numbers of different types of refurbs. You know, but you know, we are obviously seeing certain signs of embodied carbon rising up the agenda with the November, was it, I think, the refusal of the Tulip as a development project in London, and the Foster designed tower and embodied carbon was given as one of the two reasons for its rejection. And obviously the sort of the percolating issue of the M&S building in London at the moment as well, with embodied carbon sitting as a big concern within that. It is just worth saying in terms of embodied carbon. So again, I won't dwell on the detail, but for anyone who's interested, when I send the information and the links to this, we've again sort of analysed it and set out when we think the regulation, A, of measuring embodied, and then B, of reducing the amount of allowable embodied carbon should come in for different building types. And again, that's partly in terms of, you know, bigger buildings built by bigger companies, and they can sort of seed the knowledge quicker into their activities. The smaller buildings are much more challenging to get this new layer of knowledge into. So, you know, at a basic level, the orange outline bit at the front end, that's mandatory measurement communicated that it's going to happen. The solid orange boxes are when mandatory measurement of embodied carbon and disclosure comes into force. The purple boxes will show when minimum standards begin to kick in, where that trajectory of ratcheting begins. And then the pink is the sort of progressive tightening that happens after that. So again, just trying to indicate that when we look at government policy proposals or government consultations, we can sort of look and see how it performs against what we've got there. And then I guess you know, I've kept infrastructure light on this, but even more, you know, we sort of moan a lot that, you know, government don't have a coherent plan for housing retrofit. You know, we don't have an agreed strategy around how to address the decarbonisation of our existing commercial stock. But actually, maybe more than anything, what we need for a net zero infrastructure approach is a real systems thinking. You know, when we're looking at the sort of the scale of the projects and the sizes there, that sort of balance between performance, a whole wider range of societal impacts, embodied carbon, integration with surface transport, integration with the energy infrastructure, you know, we really just need a complete shift in mindset when it comes to infrastructure if we're going to reduce those emissions. And you know, what we can't get, it's one of the few areas we can't get to zero because of supply chain issues around the embodied carbon impact. So it's one of the areas where at the very back end of 2050, there's a small residual amount of built environment emissions that we will probably still need to offset. And that'll be through a combination of land use change and some sort of greenhouse gas capture technologies. And within all of this, for anyone who's familiar with the sort of regulatory approaches past 2080, will probably need to be implemented across all projects as you know, one of the many steps to take on this. In terms of where next for UKGBC, so, you know, we've got a massive programme of engagement, both in Whitehall, up in Scotland, and with various combined and local authorities around the roadmap and what it means. And in fact, we're in discussion up in Scotland about whether we do a Scottish specific one, because they've got a 2045 target, and there's a keenness for us to remodel for that. But what we will be doing with ARP and other partners is looking at rolling updates for the underlying data, and then looking at slightly longer range rolling updates about progress against that. So making sure that we can always understand where the baseline is on a yearly or 2 yearly basis. And then we can maybe on a 3 yearly basis cast forward and say what, you know, which of the policies have come into play, what industry actions have been taken, how does that recalibrate what we need to do between any particular time and moving forward. And I think I've overrun by a couple of minutes, so apologies for that, but that's me. Thank you.
Super. Thank you very much, Simon. That's a huge amount of data there. I think I probably should say that all of this will be available for our listeners. We'll make sure a recording of this goes out. I'm sure there's lots of questions. I have lots of questions, but before we host those, let's go straight over to Orlando. Do you want to start sharing your screen now, Orlando, and give us your presentation?
Sorry, I'm just
moving
around on the screens. But yeah, thanks very much, Simon. That was fantastic talk. So I'm going to talk about embodied carbon for the next 15 minutes or so. I mean, Simon's already given a lot of information about the kind of UKGBC and macro level approach, and I guess this presentation is a bit more kind of back to basics on what embodied carbon is. So hopefully that's kind of the right level for some people watching this as well. Can you see that?
Yep, let's come through. Super.
Great. So why embodied carbon? What is embodied carbon, and how can we address it? So, I mean, of course, I'm sure lots of you in the room know, but if we keep going on as business as usual, we will surpass 1.5 degrees in around the 2040s, and that's according to the latest IPCC report. And the consequences of doing that are pretty horrendous. I mean, if we anywhere above 1.5 to 2 degrees C warming around the world has huge consequences for life on the planet, both ecosystems and human communities as well. And this is just a graphic that I love from Information is Beautiful. I think just really hammers home the point of just how widespread the impacts of surpassing these targets are. So in terms of global emissions, I think Simon's already said, but I think Simon said the UK values, but in terms of global emissions, embodied carbon of construction materials accounts for 10% of global emissions. That's more than aviation and shipping combined. So we have a huge impact. And we know that we need to minimize emissions, and to do that, rapid, far-reaching and unprecedented changes are required. So we have a lot of work to do on embodied carbon, which until very recently has not been discussed nearly enough. And just to give you a quick idea of how much impact you can have as a built environment professional on global emissions through your professional work compared to your personal lives, we often think of kind of reducing the amount that we're flying, might be going vegan, or cutting down on our car driving. That's fantastic stuff, and we all need to do that. But we also have the privilege of a huge opportunity to make even bigger, sort of 2 orders of magnitude larger carbon reductions through our works. In this example, if we just reduce the embodied carbon of a typical office by 20%, we can save 900 tons of CO2. And thankfully, the industry is moving forward. So there are signs that, and I've just picked out one particular lever for change, which is policy, because I think it's a particularly important one. Of course, every single stakeholder in the built environment needs to act, and the UKGBC roadmap has sort of really clear guidelines for what each stakeholder group should do. But I think my sense, at least anyway, is that lots of, especially in the design community, where I'm from, there's lots of willingness to make change. And I think once the policy sort of lock is taken off, then I think the industry could really accelerate towards net zero. So just an example, in London, we have the London plan, and as of last year or maybe the year before, there is a policy in that requires a carbon assessment at the pre-planning stage and also at the post-completion stage, so that we have so the design teams are forced to actually think about how they're going to reduce carbon and what they're going to do, which is fantastic. And this graph on the right is taken from some work that C40 cities have done that shows the gradually increasing number of policies in cities around the world that address embodied carbon. So you can see that if you're not thinking about it now, you certainly will be thinking about it in the next 5 years in your daily work. And again, Simon mentioned policy in the UK, and I'm really pleased that some people that I work with, fantastic people like Will Arnold, the iStruct, Tim Dundecker, Julie Godefroy, and others have come together and have pitched this Part Z new carbon regulation to the UK government, which would require carbon assessments in all projects, and then after it's been in place for a few years, then it would require, and data has been collected, it would set carbon targets to be adhered to. So that is really promising. I very much hope that goes through Parliament really quickly. So what is embodied carbon? Just taking a step back, it is, so with the over life cycle of a project, we manufacture products, we transport them, we construct them, we maintain and repair them during the life cycle of a building or asset, and then they're processed at their end of life. And into that goes a whole load of materials and energy, and out comes waste and pollution and the greenhouse gas emissions. And that's what we call, that's what we refer to as embodied carbon. This is a diagram of the life cycle, showing the life cycle stages of a building. And this is, if you're not familiar with it already, I really recommend that you familiarize yourself with these modules from A to D, because that's kind of how whole life carbon is referred to in practice. So everything in pink is embodied carbon. So we have the manufacturing, construction, in use and end of life stage. The yellow is operational carbon, And on the right-hand side, we have this kind of circular economy module, which basically allows you to quantify the benefits or loads of using those materials from your building in a certain way after their end of life. And embodied and operational together, whole life carbon. So I think it's just useful also to have an understanding of how operational and embodied carbon kind of share the whole life carbon total value. So this is just an in-depth study of six ARUP buildings that some of my colleagues did. The blue and the dark blue and green parts of the pie chart are the embodied carbon, and the grey parts of the pie chart are operational carbon. So you can see this gives you an idea of how much the split between them can vary from project to project. Really depends on the context in which the project's in, and any project constraints beyond any carbon targets. But it's just really useful. On average, it's around 50-50 at the moment. So embodied carbon is definitely just as important. And the really critical bit is the green bit is the A1 to A5 embodied carbon, and those are the life cycle modules where the emissions are released by the time that the project is completed. So they're released first. So really, you can see how much of a big chunk of the whole life carbon the green bit is. So it's really critical that we reduce that now as soon as possible, so that we can reduce emissions today. And it's also, we talk about embodied carbon, but I'm talking about embodied carbon, but it's just to kind of hammer home the point. It's really important to consider both operational and embodied, especially when you're considering a refurbishment project, for example, to understand the balance between the two for different schemes that you might be looking at. So this graph here just shows a particular study that some of my colleagues did a while back, that looks at the carbon payback time for the kind of capital investment of carbon from the materials that are put into a refurbishment, a rebuild, and a new build scheme, against the black line. The black line that you see is the existing building carbon emissions, and then you can kind of see the blue and the pink lines, the various refurbishment levels and how long it would take to pay back that carbon emissions. So it's really important to do this kind of holistic thinking, so that then we can choose the best option. Calculating embodied carbon is very simple. If you haven't done it already, you take a quantity, you multiply it by a carbon factor, and you do that for every product in your building, for every life cycle stage. You add it up and you get your building project embodied carbon. However, selecting your carbon factor, I will admit, can be complex. It requires a bit of judgment and also robust data. So that bit can be tricky. However, I've co-authored this guide with Dr. John Orr and Will Arnold at the iStruct, which hopefully helps to kind of demystify how to select carbon factors for embodied carbon calculation. So that's been really popular, and that's also been translated into an Excel-based tool, which is, both of these things are free to use, free to access from anyone. You don't have to be a member of the iStruct. I'd really recommend looking at these two if you intend on trying to calculate embodied carbon on your project. And it's an iStruct production, but it's applicable to any design discipline, really. They're the same principles for calculating embodied carbon. And those documents had a really positive impact so far, been downloaded thousands of times. They're being used as a basis for carbon calculation by loads of companies now. And other professional bodies are looking to do a similar thing, and it's prompted further research as well into embodied carbon, which is fantastic. Another thing that came out of the guidance on embodied carbon that I co-authored was the need for really understanding what good and bad looks like in terms of embodied carbon. So this was a rating scheme that a few of us who do a lot of work with the iStruct came up with, which is basically like a fridge sticker for embodied carbon. And it's just really useful gives you a way to contextualize how good or bad the embodied carbon of your building is. So this one is just for structure and superstructure, but because I think it was a really good idea. It's been developed, and LETI have taken it on and kind of expanded that idea to a number of different building typologies, but also to consider the whole life carbon of a building. So not just the structural elements, but the facade, architectural elements as well, and the services elements. So you can see here, it's the same idea. They're just a number of fridge stickers sort of in strips across the page. And this is kind of the basis going forward for understanding how good or bad your building is. Currently, business as usual is around about an E, so the lightest shade of red on this diagram. So still got a lot of improvement to do. And you can see on the right-hand side, C is the LETI 2020 design target. So in 2020, we should be designing buildings to be a C. So we're still quite far off that. So we've got a lot of work to do there in the next couple of years. The REBA 2030 built target is a B. So any buildings being built in 2030 need that. And LETI 2030 design target is an A. So if you're designing something in 2030, you should be designing something with an A rating, which would be fantastic if we can get to, and we really need to do it. And of course we need to, so this diagram kind of shows the rough distribution of projects across the built environment, and really we just need to be shifting that to the left as much as possible to get up to those better ratings. So how can we minimize embodied carbon? Well, we need to start by calculating it. Understanding the numbers is extremely powerful to inform design decisions, but also just understanding the carbon emissions in your building allows you to find hotspots so you can focus your efforts on reducing it, and then you can make climate impact informed design decisions. And it just improves not just your project teams, but the whole industry's understanding of embodied carbon in buildings. So it's really, really critical. We should calculate it whenever there is a significant design decision to make, so that it can be integrated into the decision-making process. But also we should calculate it at the end of each design stage so we can track the progress across a project and post-completion, because we need to know exactly what the embodied carbon of our buildings actually is, rather than just what we think it would be based on our assumptions during design. And we need to do it the earlier the better. So it's just very simple diagrams to show that our ability to reduce carbon decreases over a project timeline as decisions get baked in. And Arup, we're taking this really seriously at Arup. So we've starting this month, sorry, we're going to be calculating whole life carbon on all of our projects around the world, not just in the UK. It's a really big undertaking, but really, really exciting. And I hope other companies follow suit. Because we're short on time, I'm just going to skip through some of the details on things you can do. But I would just say, in terms of minimizing carbon, I think it's really important to have really strong client and collaborator communication. I think that there's technical expertise needed, but there's also a lot of collaboration work that's needed to really realize the significant changes that we need in our projects. We need to be advocating for reductions within our teams. We need to be transparent about the assumptions that we're making and how we've calculated things. Don't let uncertainty deter you. There's still quite a lot of progress to be made in terms of the data availability in terms of data availability for materials. We need to coordinate with the design team so that we're making sure that our embodied carbon reductions, say as a structural engineer, don't adversely impact those of the facade engineer or architect. And we need to be clear with our clients that the guidance and data is developing on this topic. If I start a project now, in 5 years' time, I might think that different assumptions are better for my building. So it's really important to make sure that that everyone is aware of sort of the position of that embodied carbon is still in its infancy. So I'll just finish by saying that we need different buildings. We can't continue designing as we are and just hope for a silver bullet to come along. We need radical change. We need to minimize the amount of materials that we use, and it needs to happen all the way through the supply chain of projects. Thanks very much.
Super, thank you, Orlando, and thank you for keeping our time there. Yes, we do like to keep about 10 minutes reserved for Q&A, and just to quickly sort of suggest a couple of things, policy shifts was quite an interesting point, and just bear with me while I bring back in Simon into the discussion. So Simon, you should be able to share your camera now. So policy shifts, yes, that was a real couple of words that stuck with me, and the shift is quite interesting there. And exponential number of policies coming forward, potentially, I'm thinking of overload, and I'm thinking of all those life cycle carbon consultants who are going to be particularly busy over the next few years. But anyway, Tom, do you want to start fielding some questions from the audience? And I think if we can all join in and give our view, that would be really interesting. So
yeah,
Tom.
Thanks, Simon. And thank you also, Simon and Orlando, for your presentation. It's really insightful. I think one of my key takeaways is that the roadmap's a really strong tool for communication. We can talk about 48% of emissions and 16%, but actually what does that mean? By 2035, we need to be doing X, by 2030, Y. Really good to be seeing these recommendations. I'm going to dive right in. There's a question from Bob Ench. Quite provocative. Do you really believe the government actually has the will to make this happen? Are they going to make it happen in their own procurement? And also, why are we waiting until 2030 for SOS heat pumps? Should it be mandatory now? Simon, do you want to dive in on that one first?
Yeah, I mean, it's exactly the sort of question we ask ourselves all the time, to be honest. They've set the 2050 net zero carbon target safely far away, that they were able to be lauded for the ambition, but without actually having to have a lot of detail at the time as to how to get there. We got that in large part for the built environment in the autumn with the publication of the heat and building strategy and the net zero strategy, which theoretically should have painted the picture about whether they'd done enough thinking for me to believe they have the will to make it happen, to answer Bob's question. Unfortunately, what we got were piecemeal slices of policies rather than anything coherent and sort of coordinated across the industry. And that's the real concern for us. This stuff is bloody complicated. We've got to start doing it in enormous numbers really quickly. So, from the top down on the government side, we needed and still need real confidence, and industry needs real confidence to invest in its people and its supply chains, and to know that government isn't going to sort of go stop start and change that policy direction. So I think they've got the will, but at the moment, it doesn't feel like they've quite got the wherewithal. And we see pockets of things that sort of make me feel more comfortable on it, but not brilliant. In terms of public procurement, it is something we're really concerned about, that they aren't leading by example enough, or certainly at a national government level aren't. At UKGBC, my team is pulling together a public procurement campaign this year to put a lot more pressure on it. There are a lot of pieces of regulation of varying sorts across government that should mandate much higher performance in our public sector stock and in government controlled activity. But it's very piecemeal. It's ill recorded, and we seem to be missing components of that quite a lot. So we are concerned about that, as you obviously are, and are pulling together a campaign to try to address it. In terms of air source heat pumps, it's not that we're waiting to 2030 to sort of require heat pumps, but that's the point at which you would not be allowed to sell a gas boiler after that. And the main reason for that timing, and the government at the moment are looking at 2035, and they're looking at 2035 as an ambition. We are saying 2030 needs to be a cliff edge, that you can't sell them anymore. The reason it needs to take that long is because it will take a long time to train enough installers, to get householders aware enough of what's going to happen, to check with the energy sector and the DNOs that there aren't capacity issues in particular areas. We want to rule things out. We need to be engaged with the transport industry to make sure that we're sort of carefully considering the deployment of heat pumps alongside EVs, and just making sure that we're doing things intelligently. But I think the two big ones for me are, we need heat pumps to be better performance than they are at the moment, and we need more people better trained to do it, and that's going to take time. A lot of the stuff we need to do the rest of this decade is a lot about scaling up and skilling up, to use the same expression I used earlier. So if we can mandate no gas before 2030, magic, but I think that would be challenging based on where we are at the minute.
Thanks, Simon. Yeah, picking up on your point about upskilling, part of this discussion is about being able to model and assess whole life carbon. Orlando, what's your view? Are there enough carbon consultants out there to be able to achieve all the analysis we need right now or in 5-10 years time?
Probably not. I mean, based on the busyness of the teams in Europe, at least anyway, I think that everyone's looking to rapidly expand, and everyone's trying to hire new people to come into the sustainability teams from all companies. I think we don't just need LCA consultants. I think we need LCA consultants. We also need just the average level of ability to do a carbon assessment to increase across all design disciplines. So it should be a key part of the structural engineer skill set, should be a key part of the facade designer skill set, to be able to calculate carbon and use it as a metric to make a decision, just like they might do for any of the other key metrics like cost or even just like looking at strength criteria and things like that, to have an awareness at least of the impacts of their decisions. So I think, and for me actually, that's the most important thing. I think in the way a design team normally works, an LCA consultant might not necessarily be there at every design team meeting, whereas actually the core design disciplines will be there every week. They'll be informing the decisions, they'll have the client's ear more often, so they need to be the ones that are also advocating and feel confident doing that, and therefore we need to upskill absolutely everyone to be able to talk about it and to do something about it.
If I can just add to that, I think that's absolutely bang on, and I would include within that, a whole swathe of people across local authorities across the country, because the understanding and literacy on energy performance is pretty locked in most places, but the understanding and literacy on embodied and whole life carbon in planners, and a whole range of people invested in it, and local authorities really will need upskilling as well.
Absolutely, it's asking for the right things. So in briefs for projects, you need to, if the brief isn't good, if the brief doesn't challenge the design team to do something, and the contractors to do something to reduce carbon, then it's less likely to happen. But if it's a good brief, then it can really create an enabling atmosphere for making good, decent reductions.
So that leads on to a question about policy and local plan development and so on, where some local authorities don't have any ambitions for sustainability. Some might say all new build to be BREEAM excellent. Is BREEAM enough these days? BREEAM plus passive house, would that be enough? What's your view on that? Go on, Orlando.
I'm happy to go. I mean, in terms of BREEAM, I don't think it is enough. Definitely not in terms of embodied carbon. I think it's really good in setting like a baseline, making sure design teams thinking about the right kind of things. But because it's one assessment suit for all projects, it's not normally tailored to specific projects. You can quite often miss the really big ticket items for a particular project through it. So you can use it as a basis, and it's a great kind of leveler baseline, but to make the changes we need, it's definitely not enough.
I think I would just add slightly more widely on the planning point. We were due to have a sort of quote unquote planning overhaul this year. The level of ambition as to how planning is going to be addressed seems to have been muted slightly in recent months, but with much more direct link to levelling up. I guess one of the things that we hear in the background are attempts to inhibit local authorities and local planning authorities from setting higher standards than a norm, and being able to sort of push further, faster for their area. And I think, we at UKGBC and all of our partners really want local authorities who have that ambition and foresight and know their area the best can set higher standards. What we don't want are places like Cambridge not being able to demand better and demand it faster and go further. So I think, you know, a real watchword for me in the planning space would be not inhibiting ambition across planning authorities.
Thanks. So combining a couple of questions, Mike White posted that there's a suggestion that the government won't lead on issues, but needs to, well, inherently follows public opinion. So Bob Ench has also asked, what can we do to help you? How can we transform public opinion on this issue and make an effective change?
Sorry, I missed that, Tom. I was trying to find it in the chat. What was the question, sorry?
How can we help you? What's the best way to influence public opinion?
So influencing public opinion will be brilliant, you know, and sort of we just about touched on it, but you know, with housing retrofit being the biggest individual chunk within that, and the repeated failures of this in recent times, the Green Deal, the Green Homes Grant, you know, there will be a level of public ennui and disbelief when we come up with whatever the next one is. So there will need to be a really concerted campaign among progressive end of industry, hopefully trusted consumer facing voices to sort of sell this in well to people that you know, we're not going to let them down again on it. So I think there's a really big national public communications campaign on this. The absolute tragedy with what's happening in the Ukraine and the linked impacts on fuel pricing and cost of living issues more widely mean that, you know, now is a time when people will understand the drastic and dramatic impacts of those rising costs, and at the same time the amazing benefits that energy efficiency programs and stuff will give. So I think, you know, everyone lending their voice locally, or if you have the ability to sort of impact on national government thinking, will be massively helpful. But they need to very quickly pull together that public facing campaign, which, you know, I'm pretty sure has not been done yet.
Tom, I'm afraid I'm going to have to cut us short now. We're close approaching 2 o'clock, and I'm sure we all have our next Zoom or Teams meeting booked in the diary. And there's actually lots of questions coming through now, and I'm really sorry that we can't answer them all. So if I can, on behalf of the CFCI today, thank both Simon and Orlando for stepping up and giving us this fascinating talk. I think there's an amazing amount of information out there, and I would recommend people do download and read the UKGBC reports, and even if you can, the iStruct reports are really, really useful. So lots of information to go through, lots of bedtime reading. So once again, thank you very much, everyone. Simon, you're going to have to hand me back host to shut down the meeting. I can't do that at the moment. But on behalf of the CFCI and all our audience today, thank you very much for listening today. I'm going to end the meeting now, and I'd rather end ceremoniously, chuck you all out. So have a good rest of your day, and thank you very much, everyone.
Cheers.
Goodbye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.